my name is Safar. By me here today is Abror, and our guest today on our next Silk Road Revival podcast series is Professor Karen Macours. I hope I pronounced that right. The agenda today will consist of three parts. In the first part, we will ask you some personal and work-related questions to get to know you and your works better. In the second part, we will specifically focus on one of your research works, which is cash transfers, behavioral changes, and cognitive development in early childhood, evidence from a randomized experiment. And in the third part, we'll focus on your another research work, which will be seasonal migration and early childhood development. First, I will briefly introduce you to our audience. Professor Karen Macours is a chair professor at the Paris School of Economics and a senior researcher at INRAE. France's National Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment. So she works at the intersection of development and agricultural economics, studying how social programs, early childhood investments, and rural policies reduce poverty and raise productivity in low and middle income countries. Her research is known for rigorous randomized evaluations, famously showing that Nicaragua's conditional cash transfers improved young children's cognitive development and health. She earned her PhD at UC Berkeley. I guess we may kick off with the part one now. Professor Macours, my first question would be, what first drew you to the field of economics? Was there some open eyes moment that made you realize that this is what you want to be doing for the rest of your life?
Good to be with you today. Thanks for having me and thanks for the question. I actually started my career as an agricultural engineer, so my first degree is not in economics, or as kind of an engineer. It's a biological science engineering degree, basically. It's a bit broader than agricultural engineering. But in any case, but I was interested in the social issues, and I soon realized that economics provides a toolkit that is both scientifically rigorous in the sense that it's based on kind of math and proofs, etc. to a certain extent, but also allows to answer questions that are social in nature. And the questions that I was interested in from the beginning was kind of the challenges facing rural populations in particular in low and middle income countries. So bringing the two pieces of my interest together, if you want.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. And my next question would be, so you have split your career between Paris School of Economics and also the National Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment, and you worked right at the junction of development and agriculture. So what made you choose that bridge as your as your specialization, and what can this combo study that pure development or pure agriculture might miss?
So maybe first a clarification. So at the Paris School of Economics, we are all kind of faculty at PSC and associated with different research centers, and some of us are associated to the French equivalent of what exists in many countries, kind of the National Agricultural and Environmental Research Centers, which typically have, hard science, kind of agronomist type of science, but also social science. So this is not that I do different types of research. It's just that I have two different affiliations. That said, and as I mentioned before, kind of all my work does focus on rural population, economic questions around agriculture, but also on rural poverty more broadly speaking. And the reason for me to do that is because once we look at low-income countries and to a certain extent also low-middle-income countries, the vast majority of the poor in those countries still live in rural areas, and in rural areas, a big part of income comes from agricultural-related activities, and so so in terms of if we want to think of problems of rural poverty or poverty in general, which is the ones that motivate me ultimately, kind of this for me is a natural kind of place to start thinking of this problem. It's also true that the rural populations and populations involved in agriculture in particular are particularly strongly affected by all the changes that the planet is witnessing, whether they're the most directly affected by climatic changes, by environmental changes and kind of reductions in soil fertility, environmental quality, etc. In addition to being exposed to macro shocks, whether that's prices of fertilizer, as we've seen in the recent couple of years, obviously are the providers of food, and therefore kind of both vulnerable and important for any kind of food security type of questions. And so, which means that these are populations that kind of certainly are facing a lot of challenges where, in context where there is a lot of market imperfections that impede them from reacting optimally to those challenges, and hence kind of room for public policy interventions, and serious thinking about what are the type of public policy interventions that may make a bigger difference in this context. Again, not questions that are obvious, because with multiple challenges occurring in the same type of places and on the same type of people, and given the principle of the second best, it's not necessarily obvious which combination of policies will work in certain contexts, and hence kind of both an important kind of source of research ideas, but also potentially a domain in which rigorous evidence can make a difference in terms of informing policy at the country level or at the regional level.
Thank you so much. Yeah, got the idea.
Yep, thanks a lot. So my next question would be, your teaching and mentorship spans econometrics, development microeconomics, and impact evaluation methods, and you have advised many PhD students. So what core skills do you push your students to master in their first year that pay off for the rest of their career?
That's a great question. So one of the issues that we indeed push PhD students in their first year to think about is to be very kind of, in a certain way, to be ambitious and in terms of the type of research questions they're interested in, and to go beyond their obvious kind of core interests in terms of thinking about, in a broader sense, what are the puzzles, what are the questions, what are the policy questions that are open there, and to then collaborate with peers to address those questions. And so that is an important skill right up front, is to be able to fruitfully collaborate with other economists, there's different ways of doing that, with peers, with seniors, with juniors, but I think a lot of scholarship, all scholarship in economics, I think almost all these days is a collective exercise, and a lot of it happens among peers, and so that's something that one. Of course, then that allows the whole economists, and then allows also to take advantage of comparative advantages. Some people are better at one thing, some other people are better at the other thing, but also kind of just talking from an early on in the research project, talking through all the steps of the project, and kind of making sure that you're not going in circles, but kind of having a sounding board with somebody that is equally interested in it, I think is an incredibly valuable skill to have. And so it is, one thing that I always say, when I was in graduate school, I learned way more from all my fellow students than any of the professors that were fantastic. And it's not that I learned something from the professors, but clearly, kind of the time with your peers is, if you organize it productively, it's much longer. And so I think that's something really important for any of you considering about graduate school.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. And so my next question would be about how you pick research questions. So, as you know, it takes years sometimes to complete a research paper, and your motivation often shrinks over time. So, how do you approach choosing the right research questions? What filters do you apply, for example, social value or just pure self interest? Yeah.
So one of my main filters for any question is like, okay, let's say if I think of a question, or if, and then the same thing if I went in my mentor and advising, there's a question on the table. The first thing to think about is, so what? Like, if we answer that question, what are we going to be able to do with the answer? Can we show that this matters for something we ultimately care about in the sense of welfare? Um, and that doesn't mean we always have to be able to show empirically everything along the theory of change until the welfare outcome. But can we make an argument, a credible argument, that knowing the answer to the question will inform, can inform a decision, a policy, an intervention that ultimately matters down the line for welfare. And so then kind of, you know, a lot of my work is around impact evaluations of interventions by NGOs, by governments, and others. So some of those kind of questions that come because there are partners that reach out and saying, oh, we're interested in the impact of our approach. And so then you kind of think about, okay, if we actually answer this question, and whether knowing in advance that we may find a positive result, a zero result, or a negative result, is this something that we can, you know, we collectively, we not necessarily we the individual researcher, but kind of together with the partners, etc. Are we going to be able to use this information, possibly in combination with other information? Obviously, no study stands on its own to inform decision making. So that's kind of the starting point. So then, in a lot of my research, kind of the second part of the answer is I you know, tend to or try to the extent possible, early on in the research project, spend time in the context, so on the field, doing qualitative work, understanding better what are both the context, but also the potential mechanisms, the potential reasons why things may not work, etc. And I think in a number of my papers, the kind of the interesting inside of the paper has started from that work, where we kind of, you know, we set out to study something, we had kind of a theory of change in mind, but then going to the field, we realized that there's an important part of this picture that we missed, that we are kind of hearing from the stories in the field. Can we try to, you know, can we model that? Can we better understand that? Can we show empirical evidence of that phenomenon? And sometimes, going back to the time frame that you mentioned, sometimes that, you know, takes a relatively short period of time, and sometimes that takes a very long period of time. Again, because we're working in context where people are solving complex problems, it's not a surprise in a certain way that as outsiders, we don't necessarily understand all of that immediately. And it may take time to work with the data, to talk to many people, but also to kind of conceptually think about what's going on, to finally kind of understand really what are we learning from this context, not just from this context, but also what are we learning from this that then may be relevant for other contexts, for people who have a bit similar issues or similar problems.
Thanks a lot. So my next question would go like this. So economically, if we say there is a young government, a young country, so if a government can invest only in a few things early in life, what are the highest return bets and why? What do you think?
So the way you pose the country, the question is impossible to answer, right? Because no country exists in the abstract, right? So and indeed in all the work, I think all good development economics work starts from the context and from understanding the constraints in that particular context. So the constraints, the possibilities, the challenges, etc. And so there is no one answer to the question. As much as, I could tell you, I think, a lot of my work is on human capital one way or the other. So clearly, I think that's important. But that doesn't mean that, your abstract country should always invest in that and not, for instance, in roads or in, something else, depending on the context, the constraints, the possibilities, etc. And so of course, that also separates kind of micro from macroeconomists, right? We don't necessarily kind of think at that level kind of questions, but really thinking about, once a government has set a priority, what do we know in this given context and given the constraints, what could be the possible types of interventions that can help reach that priority, and then can we test that, can we provide evidence of that, and can we help move forward?
Got it, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last question for the part one, I would say, is about your work at the World Bank. So you helped to write the World Bank's World Development Report of 2008 on agriculture for development. So what are some of the lessons from that report that you still use today and carry with yourself, like when advising governments or NGOs on kind of rural policy? Yeah, that's my question.
That's the big question. Let me first clarify something to make sure we're on the same page here. So I was a member of the team for the WDR on agriculture for development in 2008. I wasn't involved with all the different chapters of that report. That said, of course, I'm familiar with the report. One of the 2008 WDR came after it kind of came around the time and after the start of the world food crisis around that time, and after a period with very strong declines in investment in definitely public investment in agriculture in low and middle income countries. And so one of the messages of the report, one of the important messages of the report, was to say, wait a minute, given where the world is going in terms of I think the report was at that point, and you'll see that the report is relatively silent on climate change. This is almost 20 years ago now. I think the awareness was more limited at that time. It's not that there wasn't any awareness. I think it was less kind of center of mind. But independently of that, there was already a food crisis. Population was increasing also, and yields in while in the 70s there had been a big gain in agricultural productivity from the Green Revolution. The world as a whole, in a certain way, didn't have another one of these big wins in terms of agricultural productivity since then. And if anything, things seem to go slightly backwards, or at least we're not improving with any kind of reasonable speed in terms of yield, in terms of and definitely in terms of productivity, etc. Now, some of that is not a surprise, and there is of course a large literature about as countries develop, more skilled people moving out of agriculture, returns being outside of the sector, etc. And also not all countries having necessarily a comparative advantage in agriculture. And so the report was not to say we should only worry about agriculture, but again saying, well, to kind of first of all, if you do want to invest in agriculture, and there may be good reasons to do so, given again most of the poor are in rural areas. Food ultimately is going to have to come from agriculture, etc. Then what are the type of investment you may want to do? On the one hand, but then also kind of from a broader perspective, right? So that's why it was a World Development Report. It's like, should countries invest more in agriculture, and which types of countries? Individual countries, but also the world as a whole. Again, since then a lot of things have changed. but clearly, one of the lessons of the Green Revolution is that investments in global public goods in agriculture can have a very high return, right? So the high yielding maize and rice varieties that are the origin of the Green Revolution, were the product of collective investment in breeding in Mexico and in the Philippines, a system that then kind of got expanded and kept on having kind of breeding improvements over the next 50 years or so. But investment in that type of global public good, whether that's improved breeding, improved practices, anything that you can kind of you need to invest in the innovation. It takes time to develop it, but once you have it, once the CIMMYT came up with the high yielding maize, it then could spread everywhere in the world. Of course, with some adaptation, some further research needed, but the core idea of the public good was clear. In the same way, it's exactly the same way as with vaccines, with same logic. And so agriculture and medical and agricultural innovations in a certain way are the key examples of where by all national governments there is a logic for public good investment. And so one of the messages of the report was kind of to not forget about that, and to try to both internationally and nationally reinvest in the R&D for agriculture, since if you want to have productivity gains, they're going to have to come from somewhere, and they're not going to come from the private sector, or at least not only from the private sector, given the public good nature of the technologies, right? So that was, I think, one important message. There was another important message around, again, going back to context, not all countries should follow the same approach. Countries like Madagascar, where now I do a lot of work with 80% of the population in agriculture, in very limited other work opportunities, you're going to have a different strategy in agriculture there than, let's say, in Brazil, where kind of there's been a lot of structural transformation happening, where the economy is more diversified, where there is still an important focus on agriculture for export on very large surfaces, etc. But the approach, the wide strategy for Brazil is going to be very different than the wide strategy for Madagascar, and similarly and then kind of there's kind of in between, kind of the country like Kenya, for instance, where that is going to be somewhere in the between phase, right? So, or Uzbekistan for that matter. So then in terms of the parts that I worked on, and going back to know kind of what the relevant lessons for governments even today, apart from kind of the types of investments to do, it was more on the micro questions and thinking about, the people in agriculture and the households in agriculture, where a lot of the focus has been traditionally of people working in the sphere on yield, which is land productivity. If we're thinking about agriculture for reducing poverty, we care about labor productivity, right? It's the individuals working in agriculture that need to have enough income per person that is working in agriculture. And so if you think about labor productivity, then probably you need a different type of investment, a different type of technology than if you're trying to increase yields, right? So some technologies or practices they may increase yield, but at such a high labor cost that is not worth doing. No irrational farmer is going to make those investments because they rationally don't want to invest all that labor. And so pushing those type of very labor-intensive technologies onto, through the extension system, etc., is not going to work. And instead, we may want to think about what are the types of investments we can do that increase labor productivity, that, the current language that people use is kind of turn the agricultural jobs into better jobs, not the question of having more people working in agriculture, but having them earning more when working in agriculture.
Thanks a lot. So I guess this is the end of part one. Thanks a lot for your answers, pretty insightful. So we'll move to the discussion of one of your research papers, which is cash transfers, behavioral changes, and cognitive development in early childhood, evidence from randomized experiment. Uh, so I will briefly present the context and the findings of the work now for our audience. So the study looks at a cash transfer program in rural Nicaragua that paid mothers and encouraged them to use the money for kids' nutrition, health, and learning. So because villages were randomly assigned for this, the researchers could cleanly measure the impact. What else is that within months, young children in recipient families scored higher on language and memory tests. And those gains were still there 2 years after the payments stopped. And that's pretty interesting. So the key insight here is that it wasn't just like the amount of money, it wasn't just the more money that mattered, but what mattered was how parents changed day-to-day habits, like better diets, more talking, more play with children, more preventive health care, and others. So the takeaway here, I would say, is that the well-designed transfers to mothers paired with simple guidance, like there were those messages saying that like go look after your child, so like can spark lasting improvements in early childhood development. So I hope I didn't miss any part, and I guess we can move to the questions. So, Professor Macours, what first motivated you to study how cash transfers can change parents' everyday behavior and, through those choices, children's early cognitive development? Was there maybe a specific moment or a situation in your life that motivated you to study this?
Yeah, so this is actually an example of a paper that started in the field. So we, together with my longtime co-author René Srakis, had kind of were engaging with the government of Nicaragua, the Ministry of Social, basically the Ministry of Social Protection, on this was a couple of years after the first conditional cash transfers that everybody is familiar with, a lot of people are familiar with, had been rolled out in Mexico and Brazil. So just as a backup, so in 1997, both in Mexico and in Brazil, kind of the governments decided to change the way they were kind of investing in human capital and poverty reduction. And so rather than building schools, for instance, or building health centers, they kind of said, okay, and Santiago Levy, who was kind of leading the program in Mexico in particular, kind of said, okay, we actually kind of know a lot about why children are not kind of in school, or why parents are not going to the health centers. It's kind of, there is economic constraints. It's not just, I mean, there are schools, but kids are not going to school because parents may not be able to afford the schools, because the kids may need to work, because there is not enough income, because the parents may not realize school is important. And similarly, on the health, kind of nutrition, early childhood side, the health services often were there, but people were not taking advantage of them, or were not giving the right nutrition to their children, etc. And so what we know as conditional cash transfer started in both these countries, and so in particular in Mexico, where in Mexico it had those two components, and Brazil it just started on education, but in Mexico both the health and education, where the idea was we're going to give money to poor households. We're going to first identify who are the poor households. We're going to give them money. We're going to give it to the mothers, and we're going to give this money to help substantial amounts of money to help them deal with the fact that they're poor, and so to compensate for the poverty. But we're going to give it with a set of rules. Kind of, we're going to give some conditions that you're only going to keep on receiving this money if you take your young children to the health centers and you listen to the advice, you go to information sessions about nutrition and preventive health care, etc. And for the older children, you send them to school, you make sure that they're not absent in school, etc. So those were the conditions. There was, there was other kind of details of the interventions. And then the reason why the whole world knows about this now is because in Mexico in particular, the government decided to evaluate this rigorously through one of the first RCTs in economics at large scale. So this was 506 villages across 7 states in Mexico. where they set up the RCT and very intensive data collection to analyze how those types of programs were changing behavior of the parent, were they indeed improving education and health, but also through what type of mechanisms was this happening. So this had started in 1997. First results have been coming out 2000, 2001. So when we started engaging in Nicaragua, we knew this evidence, and so the Nicaraguan government was implementing a similar program. So had kind of taken the model from Mexico, adapted it somewhat to Nicaragua, and they were implementing this already since 2000 in a number of different parts of the country. And they came to us to say, okay, saying, okay, we want to have a version of this program that helps households that are affected by shocks or that have a high probability of being affected by shocks. So I like to think of this as the Nicaraguan government being way ahead of its time. Not that many people were talking about climate change at that point, but the Nicaraguan government was worrying about protecting households against shocks and knowing that maybe we need to do something different for vulnerability that is due to shocks than vulnerability that is due to kind of chronic poverty. So we set out to work with them to think about, okay, can we take the existing conditional cash transfer program that you're already doing, and what type of adaptation would we need to do to test whether we can adapt the program so that not only is the households protected in the year or in the period that they get the transfers, but is there a way of tweaking the program so that the households kind of can help protect themselves also when the program ends? So then there was a big drought shock in the region, in the part of the section, in the dry region of the country. That's what it was called. So there was a particularly dry year, and so the government decided this is where we're going to try this. But there was not enough money for all the different villages in that region, and so randomization was a natural method to kind of say, well, to decide where the money would go, which villages would go, but also then to test these different models and compare them. And so we took the conditional cash transfer program, and then a set of households got additional money to invest in a business or in a self-employment activity. Another set of households got training, vocational training for people to be able to engage in non-agricultural activities when the droughts hit. So we have been working with the government. Of course, we also went to the field to understand the context, and I guess partly because it was a drought year and conditions were particularly severe. When we went to the villages, it struck us immediately that all the small children we were seeing were they were not very active. They were often just hanging in the arms of their mothers. They clearly were not in good shape. Many of them were when we asked the ages, mothers would say 2-3 years old, but they were not talking, they were not walking, etc. And so this kind of just hit us directly in the face, if you want, to say, well, this is an important, not just an important development issue per se, but also important to understand to what extent these types of interventions can change something about these delays in early childhood. And so that's how we started working on this. This is not something we had necessarily. I mean, we were broadly working on human capital and health, but we hadn't necessarily thought about the other components that this paper focuses on, which is the stimulation, the delays in the cognitive development, the combination of indeed nutrition, health, stimulation, and the home environment. Again, in those contexts when things are very scarce, understandably so, possibly the situation in the households can be tense, there can be violence, etc. There's harsh words, even for very young children. And so this really kind of was kind of initially a diagnostic, and then say, okay, let's see to what extent this particular intervention shifts this, because it's aimed to improve nutrition, but it could also do by relaxing some of these other constraints and by providing information about the type of nutrition that the children need, the type of preventive healthcare, but also the type of stimulation, etc., or just able to buy, for instance, a coloring book for the child to look at, kind of simple things with the means. Does that make a difference? So that's how we started on this project. So and then that's how I started working on early childhood development also, because then from there on, once you start thinking about the problem, it's hard to stop thinking.
Thanks a lot. Pretty insightful response. So my next question would be, compared with home visiting, preschool, or fortified goods, do you think does giving cash to mothers deliver more impact per dollar? Did you specifically research this, or do you have any assumptions about this?
Yeah, so I mean, the answer is going to be, as any economist answer, it depends, right? So, but I'll be a bit more specific than that. It depends on the context. So, right, so it depends on what is the most constraining factor limiting brain development of children in a certain context, and that's going to vary from context to context, right? So there is context where the diets are diverse. Preventive healthcare practices are there, kids have vaccinations, etc. But parents may not have information about stimulation practices. In that type of context, stimulation alone can make a big difference. You mentioned, a fortification. There are contexts where certain micronutrients are missing in the diet. In those contexts, fortification of those particular micronutrients can make a difference. But in other contexts, the diet may not miss those micronutrients, or the children's bodies may not be able to react to the supplements because they're too weak or there's something else missing. Very often, this is about complementarities that we don't necessarily fully understand, but often, there's definitely interactions between nutrition and hygiene, kind of the more wash-related issues, and so these are complex issues in a certain way. When we were talking about brain development, it was not going to be. If it was simple, we had to figure it out. So it's typically going to be not obviously only one thing, but whether what's going to have what is going to be the most cost effective, which is what your question is going to depend. Now, it is true that so if we narrow in the question to say, okay, let's abstract for a moment from the nutrition kind of vaccination part of things and focus on the stimulation part per se. So there is a literature on this question too, whether you have preschools versus home visiting or early childhood, even at which ages, because the home visiting programs typically are for younger children, like 18 to 36. Those are ages that the medical science teaches us that a lot of the brain development is happening, but kind of and so reasons to intervene during those ages. But home visiting, of course, can be very costly, especially in rural areas, because you need to have a home visitor going to individual homes and spending time with each family. In contrast, preschools, kind of, you have economies of scale. You bring the kids to one place. These are typically somewhat older kids, so you have this trade-off between kind of the ages. Maybe the for certain parts of brain development, 18 to 36, maybe more important, 8 months, maybe more important. For other parts, maybe the somewhat older ages are equally relevant. And of course, apart from the economies of scale, kind of the preschool or the group type of interventions can also help change norms, because they kind of, if everybody is kind of changing, for instance, practices at the same time, because the mothers are engaged in the preschools and they see all the other mothers changing, possibly that is kind of where some of the gains come from. And so there is a literature on this more narrow question that is still developing. So there's very strong and promising results from home visiting programs and from different parts of the world when done at relatively small scale. When these get scaled, kind of the impacts have been smaller. Not everywhere. There are some interesting examples, including, for instance, in China, is a version of home visiting that got scaled through the infrastructure of the state, of the former, the people that were the former kind of enforcers of the one-child policy. So it's very counterintuitive in a certain way, but kind of that leading in that context to relatively large impacts at scale. And so this is evidence that is still being generated. Typically, the larger programs we find somewhat smaller impacts, not everywhere, but the smaller impacts, on many more kids. Maybe that is more cost effective than the very big impacts on some kids. And that of course depends. You mentioned in the paper in Nicaragua, we kind of have the results during the intervention and then also 2 years later, and show that the results maintain. And so this is one of the big questions in that literature. Can we not only make sure that we have interventions that target that change on the short term, in this case cognitive development, but also do we see those gains after a number of years? Because of course ultimately the kind of the economic return to those investments is going to be when those kids are adults. You have to wait a very long time before we can measure those. But if the impacts are not there anymore after a few years, we start to worry about, okay, maybe could be that we don't observe them, or it could be that they're not there anymore. And so I think that those are, we're still tackling those, but so it's kind of the apart from the Jamaica experiment, which is the kind of the initial home visiting program by Sandra McGregor and co-authors that kind of started this literature. Most of the other ones are the randomized controlled trials, at least, are not yet started long enough for us to have the return in adulthood. And so this is therefore an ongoing research agenda still for many years to come.
Dear Professor Macours, thanks a lot. I really understand now why the context matters when comparing some economic choices. Thank you. So that's all by me. Part two is over. I guess we can move to the part three now.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot of insights. But I also would like to talk about your different paper, which is kind of similar to the current we discussed already, which is called Seasonal Migration and Early Childhood Development. So I could briefly present the paper and the main idea of it, and then we could proceed to the questions. I have, yeah, yes. So if you allow, I could briefly talk about it, and then, yeah. So I think that the paper studies rural Nicaragua, where parents often take short work trips during the off season. And this is called seasonal migration, basically temporary moves for a few months to earn income. And this paper also asks how that affects early cognitive development, meaning young children's basic learning skills like language, memory, problem solving skills, and etc. So Professor Macours found a surprising result. So when mothers migrate seasonally, especially in response to bad local years, so young children's cognitive scores become higher, while fathers' migration shows no similar benefit. Uh, I think that Professor Malcours found here that the likely reasons for that are income, more income, different spending choices, and greater decision making power for mothers, which together outweigh the loss of some direct time with the parent. Um, and I would say, like, the main key takeaway here of this paper is that policies that make seasonal work safer and support caregiving at home um, can improve significantly young children's cognitive development. Yeah, please fix me if I missed any important points. Uh, but yeah, That's it.
Yeah, you did a good job.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So my first question would be that so in many poor rural areas, families send an adult to work elsewhere for a few months, right? When local jobs dry up. Um, so your study followed families in rural Nicaragua and looked at how these temporary moves relate to young children's early learning skills. Uh, and here is the follow-up question. Why did you expect seasonal migration to help or maybe could or hurt children's development? And also, what surprised you most in this data set?
Yeah. So again, good question. This is an example of a paper that where the result goes against initial priors, including our own priors. Okay, so the that's kind of related to what I was saying before. We set out, that's why we do empirical work, because we don't know the answer. We actually want to let the data tell us what's the answer. The reason we started this work is the realization again from being in the field that this I think what is well known, but I think at that point there was very little literature about the fact that these seasonal migration patterns are very common in poor rural areas, right? So that's we know have more evidence from this in many different parts of the world. It's obviously different than kind of the realities that you and I know. And I think that's part of why many of us haven't paid attention to that. There was a literature, of course, on migration, on permanent migration, from that is a phenomenon that people have studied for a long time. But this kind of seasonal migration as a coping mechanisms, but also just as a general livelihood mechanism, I think was much less understood. And so in the context where we worked, because it was so prevalent, again, this was an area that typically had problems of drought, and also, Central America is relatively small. Nicaragua being the poorest country there, relatively high returns to seasonal migration because they can seasonally migrate to to El Salvador, to Honduras, or to Costa Rica, and make substantial more money for a couple of months and then come back. So this was a setting where this was this is an important it's a clear important part of the local economy, and so as in any migration story, then there is a long debate, right, about the positive and the negative returns to migration, where typically intuitively we think about, okay, there may be, including for any of us, right, there may be economic returns to migrate, there may be higher returns to human capital in a different place, or if it's not economic, just kind of career-wise, opportunity-wise, there may be reasons to migrate, but at the same time, that comes with kind of social and potential additional costs of partly related to family disruptions, partly related to kind of leaving known environments, etc. And so in the context, of course, of young adults or kind of young parents migrating, especially when it's mothers, kind of the other obvious cause could be kind of the fact that the lack of stimulation in this context where there was already very little stimulation to begin with. So this is again why kind of putting those two things together, why we said, okay, let's see whether we can study this. So now this is This is not an experimental paper. This is quasi experimental. It is an example where kind of the results go counter to what you would expect in a certain way in many different places, also with the instrument. And so it's kind of actually it's a case where the exclusion restriction is somewhat reasonable because of the direction of the results. So many of the stories you could argue about kind of concerns about the exclusion restriction would go in the opposite direction of what we find. And so that's why we kind of felt like it's actually important to write this paper and to have it out there, partly because, to kind of shed light on this issue that we often don't kind of think about. Documenters, start documenters in one place, and of course subsequently there's been much more work on seasonal migration in particular in South Asia and then elsewhere. Um, but that was kind of one of the kind of the reasons to write this, and then to kind of look into this puzzling question, and so finding indeed a counterintuitive result that then helps us think through, okay, what's going on here? So stimulation, sure, going back to our previous discussion, but stimulation without nutrition in very drought and nutrition deprived environments may not be that helpful, one. But two, also, or kind of, or I guess westernized conception of family may not necessarily be what we should be thinking about, because in society, in contexts where people live in extended families, as was the case in Nicaragua at the time, there is other potential caregivers that can substitute at least part of the time, and so kind of the intuition of the result basically is that in this context, men migrate anyway, independently of shocks. They would, and so the kind of the women are the ones that migrate more when they really need to. Not just women, kind of mothers of young children migrate more when they really need to, which is when there is a severe income constraint, and so then migrating ultimately is better for the children, partly because the children are taken care of by the extended family, and partly because it helps deal with the income constraints. And so that's, it kind of makes for a paper that helps also think through, okay, or a lot of the early childhood literature focuses on the mothers, including a lot of the conditional cash transfer problems focus on the mothers, as I said, and as often money to the mothers. And that's a very natural thing to do in terms of the typical caregivers, but obviously, households don't only have mothers, and so there's this interesting question about kind of the thinking through the role of the mothers and the fathers in this context, and so it fits also kind of broader. And again, the paper doesn't claim to answer those questions. It's really more one that kind of said, okay, let's put some of these questions and findings out there. Because there's a lot of other things we need to understand about this.
Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you for sharing. And I would say, like, I have my last question. So your paper points to two big channels. So it's more income and more empowerment for mothers, meaning great say over spending and parenting. So question is here, if you had to split the impact, roughly how much impact comes from extra money versus shifts uh, in.
That I don't know, right? So this is, I mean, first of all, this is an IV estimation. So what we're estimating here is a local average treatment effect, right? So splitting that local average treatment effect in two, I think, is an impossible task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And would also be informative because it is a late. So kind of I'm not even sure we should go there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Uh, I think it's pretty much by us. We have no questions left. That was really pleasant speaking with you today. And
Thanks for inviting me, and good luck with the podcast.
Yes, sure. Can't disagree with Abor here. Thanks a lot one more time for your time and for your contribution, Professor Macours. Sorry that we were a little sleepy, but we paid like maximum attention. So thanks a lot. The talk was very insightful. So a little feedbacks would be good. Like what was bad, what was good about the podcast, about the structure. Maybe we could somehow make it more interesting, more engaging for you or for our audience. What are your thoughts about this? We're open to criticism, fully.
You want me to tell you now?
Yes.
Okay, I think it's a good idea. I guess two thoughts is kind of, I think it'd be useful when you invite people to tell them a bit about the audience for the podcast. Like, would you imagine us listening to this? And then the second thing is we talked about two relatively old papers. I think people typically like talking about new papers. And so, including things that are not published yet, or at least recently published. you know, I think you may get slightly more engaging discussions when you do that.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
makes
Got
sense.
it. Sure. So, Professor Macours, thanks a lot one more time for your time and for your contribution. We do appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Sure, thank you and good luck.